I don't know why I'm writing this now, and I don't know who I expect to read it. Maybe I just want proof that these thoughts exist somewhere outside my head. I'm 22 years old. At least, that's how old I was when this really began to change me. I'm an infantryman from Poland, conscripted, and then folded into whatever remained once everything broke apart. By 1943, I was attached to a unit operating east of Minsk, fighting alongside men who no longer talked about victory. Only survival, rations, and how far the front might move overnight. I carried a rifle, dug trenches, stood guard, marched until my feet bled, and tried not to think too far ahead. I thought I knew what war would be before I saw it. I thought it would feel loud but purposeful, terrifying but meaningful. I believed, like a fool, that courage would show itself when needed, that fear could be controlled by discipline and orders. The first sign that something was wrong came during my first real combat. It wasn't during an attack. It was after. We had advanced through a small village, just wooden houses, low fences, a church with a roof already half gone. The fighting itself was confused. Shots from windows, shouting we couldn't understand. One of our men hit in the leg and screaming for his mother until someone dragged him behind a wall. Then, suddenly, it was quiet. Too quiet. I remember standing in the street, heart pounding, waiting for the next order. Instead, an officer told us to search the houses. Clear them, he said, like he was talking about rooms that needed dusting. Inside one of the houses, there was a man, old, thin, shaking, sitting at a table with a loaf of bread and a knife. He didn't raise the knife. He didn't shout. He just stared at us like we were ghosts. Someone behind me yelled something, and in the confusion, a shot went off. I don't know who fired it. I know it wasn't me. But I know I didn't stop it either. That was the first death I saw up close enough to smell the bread on the table and the smoke from our coats. It didn't look like death was supposed to. There was no drama, no final speech, just a man slumped forward and a knife clattering to the floor. Afterward, no one talked about it. We stepped over the mess and moved on. Outside, someone joked weakly about finding wine. Another man vomited behind a fence. That's when it hit me. This war wasn't going to ask me who I was or what I believed. It was going to carry me along, step by step, whether I agreed or not. I went to sleep that night in a borrowed cellar, staring at the ceiling, wondering if silence was going to follow me everywhere now, or if this was only the beginning. People think war is made of battles. That's wrong. Battles are brief. War is mostly waiting. After that village, life settled into a routine that felt wrong precisely because it felt like a routine at all. Wake up before dawn. Check weapons. Eat whatever passed for food. Usually thin soup. Sometimes bread so hard you had to soak it in water to chew. Stand around pretending not to be afraid of the sounds in the distance. Artillery thumps you learned to recognize by direction and weight. You could tell when it was meant for you and when it wasn't. And that knowledge didn't make you feel safer. Our days were spent digging and filling in the same trenches, like the earth itself was rejecting us and pushing us back out. Mud everywhere, the kind that gets into your boots and never really leaves. In winter, it froze and cracked your skin. In autumn, it swallowed you whole. Lice were constant companions. We joked about them sometimes, not because it was funny, but because saying nothing felt worse. At night, conversations drifted between men like smoke, rumors mostly. Someone said the front line had collapsed farther south. Someone else swore new reinforcements were coming. Another claimed the war would be over by Christmas, but no one asked which Christmas anymore. Fear came in waves. Before an offensive, it sat in your chest so heavy you could hardly breathe. During the march, it faded into exhaustion. Afterward, it came back sharper, because you had time to think. Waiting for orders was the worst. You could hear your own thoughts too clearly then. There were arguments too, about everything pointless. Who stole whose socks? Whether the soup was thinner than yesterday? Whether the officer knew what he was doing? Once, two men nearly fought over a cigarette, until a shell landed close enough to knock us all flat. After that, we shared what little tobacco we had like brothers again. The small joys mattered more than they should have. A letter from home, often weeks old, describing a world that felt invented. A stolen apple from an abandoned orchard. A song someone half remembered from before the war. I carried a photograph of my mother folded into my jacket, and I touched it like a talisman before sleep, as if she could still protect me from dirt and bullet. But even in these quiet stretches, the village followed me. That old man at the table, the sound of the knife on the floor. No one mentioned civilians unless they were in the way, as if words could undo what we had already seen. I started to notice something else too, how quickly we adjusted, how the extraordinary became normal, how men who had been students, farmers, clerks, ordinary people, now spoke casually about death, as if it were weather. That scared me more than the shelling, because if this was normal now, I wondered what would be left of us when it ended. The moment everything changed didn't arrive dramatically. No trumpet sound, no speech, just an order passed down quietly, like all the worst ones are. We were told to advance before dawn and probe the enemy line just beyond a wooded rise. Reconnaissance in force, they called it, a phrase that sounded careful and intelligent, which should have been our first warning. Everyone understood what it really meant. Walk forward until someone starts shooting back, then report who survives. The night before, no one slept properly. You could hear men shifting in the dark, coughing too loudly, cleaning rifles that were already clean. Someone whispered prayers. Someone else mocked him, but without conviction. I remember my hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. I wasn't ashamed of the fear yet. I still thought fear meant I cared. We moved out as the sky went gray. Low fog curling around the trees like something alive. The forest swallowed sound. That should have been comforting, but it felt like being blind. At first, nothing happened. We walked for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. I started to think the rumors were wrong, and the enemy had pulled back. That thought filled me with relief, and then, immediately, with dread, because relief in war never lasts. The first machine gun burst came from our left. Short, precise. One man went down without a sound, like his strings had been cut. Another screamed and clutched his shoulder. Orders started flying, contradicting each other. Someone shouted to spread out. Someone else yelled to get down. We did both, and neither. I crawled behind a fallen log and pressed my face into damp leaves, trying to make myself smaller than my body would allow. Bullets cracked overhead, chewing bark. The smell of gunpowder mixed with crushed pine needles. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it smelled like Christmas. Then came the artillery. It wasn't meant to hit us directly, just to cut off retreat. But at that distance, the difference felt theoretical. The ground jumped beneath us. Noise erased thought. At some point, I realized I was screaming without knowing why. It ended as suddenly as it began. Smoke drifted. Orders came again, calmer now, as if nothing unusual had happened. We pulled back with fewer men than we started with. No one counted out loud, but everyone noticed. One of those missing was Marek. Marek had slept beside me since training. He was older than me by 3 years, had a wife he talked about constantly, and a way of speaking that made everything sound manageable. He said war was chaos, but that people could still choose how they behaved inside it. We found him near the edge of the trees, face down, helmet gone. No obvious wounds that I could see. Maybe shrapnel, maybe a bullet. It didn't matter. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. And I remember thinking how unfair it was, that he didn't look afraid anymore. They told us to leave him. There was no time, no stretchers, no point. Mark the location, the sergeant said, even though we all knew no one would come back. Something in me cracked then. Not loud, not all at once, just a quiet shift. I followed orders. I turned away. I walked back without arguing. That night, when I reached for my mother's photograph, I realized I couldn't remember her voice anymore. And that's when I understood. This war wasn't just killing people. It was taking pieces of us with it slowly, methodically, until we barely noticed what was gone. After Marek, I started to see the war differently. Not as something happening to me, but something I was participating in whether I liked it or not. A few days later, we were ordered to hold a supply road that ran past another village. This one was half empty already. Doors hanging open, livestock wandering loose. Civilians were gathering what they could carry, moving east or west, depending on which rumor they believed that morning. We were told to search for partisans. That word, partisans, had weight. It justified everything. It blurred the line between soldier and civilian until it was easier not to think about the difference at all. We were taking turns questioning people when we found a young man hiding in a barn. No uniform, no weapon in sight. Just fear. He couldn't have been much older than me. Someone said he'd been seen talking to fighters weeks earlier. Someone else said that meant nothing. The officer asked questions the man couldn't answer convincingly. Partly because he was terrified, and partly because he spoke a dialect most of us barely understood. Orders came down again. Not shouted. Calm. Detui. Make an example. Others are watching. I remember feeling heat in my face, like I was about to be sick. This wasn't combat. This wasn't chaos. This was deliberate. I thought about stepping forward, saying something, anything, but my mouth stayed shut. I told myself it wasn't my decision. I told myself someone else would intervene. I told myself Marek would have known what to say. No one did. I didn't fire the shot. Someone else did. I still hear it sometimes, sharper than the sounds of battle. The man fell backward into the straw, making a strange choking sound before going quiet. Afterward, we stood there awkwardly. A few villagers stared at us, with faces so blank, they seemed carved from wood. I wanted to scream at them that this wasn't who I was, that I wasn't a murderer. But I didn't move. I didn't look away either. That night, I tried to justify it. I told myself about orders, about survival, about the danger of rebellion. I told myself one life saved others. These explanations sounded hollow even as I thought them. The truth was harder. I was afraid. Afraid of punishment. Afraid of standing out. Afraid of being next. I hated myself for that. From that day on, I understood that courage wasn't just about running forward under fire. Sometimes it was about saying no, and sometimes I realized too late silence was a choice just like any other. If you've never been there, you might think you'd act differently. I used to think that too. After the barn, something changed in the way the men looked at one another. Not openly. No one accused anyone. But there was an unspoken awareness that we had all crossed something together, even if only by standing still. You learn quickly in war who you can trust. Not with secrets, but with silence. My closest circle became smaller. There was Piotr, who pretended not to care about anything but kept a notebook of poems hidden in his pack. There was Stefan, a quiet farm boy who could repair almost anything and never talked about home. And there was our squad leader, Nowak, who drank too much when he could and stared too long at maps, as if geography itself had betrayed him. We didn't talk about Marek anymore, but his absence followed us. His bunk spot stayed empty until a replacement arrived. A boy with soft hands and eyes too large for his face. We called him Kid, because learning his real name felt like tempting fate. He laughed nervously at our jokes and tried too hard to be useful. One evening, Piotr read part of a letter aloud. His wife had written that their son had taken his first steps. He smiled when he read it, but afterward he folded the letter carefully and didn't speak for the rest of the night. I wondered what hurt more, being reminded of life continuing without you, or the fear that it might stop before you get back. My own letters from home became shorter. My mother stopped describing daily things and started writing in generalities. Health, weather, prayers. My father, who had once filled pages with advice and opinions, added only a line at the end. Be careful. Come back. I didn't know how to reply honestly. You can't explain the war to people who haven't smelled it. You can't admit what you've done without becoming someone else in their eyes. So, I wrote lies. Small ones, gentle ones. I said I was fine. I said food was enough. I said morale was good. Those lies stacked up until they felt heavier than truth. The next loss came suddenly, as they always do. Kid stepped on a mine while carrying ammunition crates. One moment he was complaining about his boots. The next, there was smoke and screaming and nothing below his knees. He didn't die immediately. He kept calling for his mother, just like that man in the village weeks before. Stefan held his hand until the end. Afterward, Stefan washed his hands over and over, even when there was no water left in the canteen. That was when I understood something else. Combat didn't just kill people. It turned love and loyalty into liabilities. The closer you let someone get, the sharper the pain when they're torn away. And yet, without those connections, we would have broken much sooner. War forces that contradiction on you. It punishes attachment, but makes it impossible to survive without it. After Kid died, the pace of everything increased, as if the war sensed hesitation and decided to press harder. Orders changed daily, sometimes hourly. Hold this position at all costs. Then, abandon it by nightfall. March through rain without rest. Dig in on ground that artillery had already turned into slurry. We stopped asking why. Explanations implied logic, and logic had clearly left the front. The enemy grew bolder. Or maybe we just grew weaker. Bombardments came before dawn and after dusk. Time to steal whatever sleep we managed. The earth shook so often that stillness felt unnatural. You could tell who was new by the way they jumped at every explosion. The rest of us flinched only when it landed too close. Food ran low. Real hunger is different from skipping meals. It changes the way you think. Men snapped at each other over crumbs. Someone stole rations, and we all knew who it was, but no one said anything. Punishment might mean fewer hands or fewer calories, and both could kill you. Rumors replaced news. One day we were winning, the next we were encircled. Someone claimed entire divisions had disappeared north of us. Another said relief was coming with tanks and fresh troops. We believed whichever version helped us get through that hour. Then came the retreat. It wasn't announced as such. Retreats never are. We were redeploying, adjusting the line, straightening the front. In reality, we were moving backward under fire, leaving equipment we couldn't carry, blowing bridges behind us while civilians tried to cross the same road. That was when I saw desperation on a scale I hadn't imagined. Columns of refugees mixed with troops, old men pulling carts, women carrying children who didn't cry anymore. A woman grabbed my sleeve and begged me, to tell her which way was safe. I didn't know. I pulled free and kept walking. At night, flares turned the sky white, and every sound made our nerves scream. Prisoners began to appear. Enemy soldiers captured during skirmishes, thin and filthy and no more confident than we were. Up close, they looked exactly like us. Tired young men clutching their helmets too tightly. Some were marched away. Some disappeared. More orders came. Hold here. No retreat beyond this point. Dig in. We dug, but the ground was flooded, churned, refusing to protect us. Shelling collapsed trenches as fast as we built them. One blast buried Piotr halfway. We pulled him out coughing, laughing hysterically, crying without pause. His notebook was gone, turned to pulp. That night, I realized I had stopped counting days. Time flattened into a single stretched moment. Noise, hunger, fear, repeat. The war was no longer something in front of us. It was closing in from every direction, including inside our own heads. I used to think breaking would be obvious, screaming, running, throwing down my rifle, and refusing to move. That's how weakness looked in my imagination. In reality, it was quieter. It started with shaking. Not fear shaking you can hide by clenching your fists, but deep tremors that ran through my arms even when I was lying still. Then came the exhaustion that sleep didn't cure. I would close my eyes and see nothing but flashes. Trees exploding, faces half seen, kid calling out. I woke up already tired. During one bombardment, I realized I was no longer thinking about survival. I wasn't praying, or bargaining, or planning. I was just empty. Shells landed, the ground jumped, and I felt nothing except irritation that the noise might tear what was left of my mind apart. That scared me more than panic ever had. The order came in the afternoon, counterattack at dusk. No support mentioned. Limited ammunition. Everyone knew what that meant. We looked at Nowak, waiting for him to say something. Anything. That made it sound possible. He didn't. He just nodded and repeated the order. I felt something snap then. Not courage. Not rebellion. A kind of clarity, sharp and dangerous. I told Nowak it was suicide. I had never spoken to an officer like that before. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Others looked at the ground. Piotr stared straight ahead like he hadn't heard me. Nowak pulled me aside. He didn't threaten me. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. If we don't go, he said quietly, they'll hang someone for it. Maybe you. Maybe you. Maybe 3 men chosen at random. That was how discipline worked now. I nodded. What else could I do? That evening, as we formed up, my body refused to cooperate. My hands fumbled with my rifle sling. My legs felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. When the first shots cracked, my vision narrowed. I couldn't hear voices anymore, only my own breathing. Too fast, too loud. I dropped to the ground and couldn't get back up. Someone shouted at me. Someone kicked my boot. I tried to move and couldn't, like my muscles had forgotten the order of things. I remember thinking, so this is it. This is how it ends. Not with bravery or shame, just failure. A medic crawled over and told them I was useless like this. He said it with anger, not cruelty. There was no time for patience. They dragged me behind a shell crater and left me there while they went forward. Lying alone in the dirt, listening to the fight move away, I felt an overwhelming, corrosive thought. I don't want to be here anymore. Not dying. Not escaping. Just gone from this place, this role, this version of myself. When it was over, fewer men came back than had gone out. No one said anything to me. That was worse than punishment. From that moment on, I knew something irrevocable had happened. Even if my body stayed at the front, whatever belief I still had in endurance, duty, and myself had finally cracked under the weight, and I couldn't tell if that made me weak or simply honest at last. The morning after my collapse, I expected consequences. Arrest, interned, transfer, a bullet with paperwork attached. That was how it usually went. I replayed the moment again and again, rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. Fear returned. Not sharp like before, but dull and constant. Instead, everything went quiet. Too quiet. By midday, an officer I didn't recognize arrived with 2 men from another unit. He gathered whoever was left of us. There were so few now it felt obscene to stand in a line. He read from a folded paper, voice flat, as if what he said happened every day. We were being pulled out, not rotated, not reassigned to rest, removed. Enemy forces had broken through farther north than predicted. The front behind us no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Holding orders were void. Communication had collapsed overnight. We were now officially cut off, which meant one thing: move west immediately or be captured. No speeches, no apologies, just that. Men reacted strangely. Some laughed. Some swore. One sat down and refused to stand up again until someone hauled him by the collar. Relief and terror mixed until I couldn't tell them apart. We destroyed what we couldn't carry. Rifles smashed against rocks. Maps burned. Ammunition dumped into mud. It felt like erasing ourselves, like admitting none of this had ever been meant to last. As we started moving, artillery chased us, not accurately, but close enough to hurry us along. Roads were clogged with fragments of other units, refugees, carts overturned in ditches. No one was in charge anymore. Officers gave suggestions instead of orders. Late that night, we walked straight into an enemy patrol. It happened fast. Muzzle flashes, shouts, then silence again. This time, the wrong kind. When it ended, we were standing over 3 prisoners. One was wounded, blood soaking his sleeve. They were young, younger than me. One of them kept saying the same word over and over, a name, maybe, or a prayer. Everyone looked at Noah. No one said it, but we all knew the question. What do we do with them? We couldn't take prisoners. We had no food to spare. No place to hand them over. No confidence we wouldn't be captured ourselves by morning. Keeping them alive was dangerous. Letting them go was insane. Someone suggested it anyway. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Noack surprised me. He cut their restraints. He told them to run east. Immediately, no tricks. They didn't believe him at first. Neither did we. Finally, they ran, stumbling, terrified, disappearing into the dark. I waited for punishment, for shouting, for someone to object. Nothing happened. That was the twist I never expected. An order not given. A line not crossed. As we moved on, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. I don't know if what Noack did was right or foolish. Maybe it cost lives. Later. Maybe hours. But for the first time in months, something happened that wasn't dictated by fear alone. And I understood something dangerous and liberating at once. Even here, especially here, choices still existed. We moved for 3 days after that without really stopping. No proper rest. No proper food. Just movement. Through trees. Across fields already chewed up by earlier fighting. Along roads we abandoned the moment aircraft passed overhead. Sleep came in fragments, sitting upright or collapsed in ditches, boots still on because taking them off felt like surrender. By the end of the first day, Stefan was limping badly. He never complained, just tightened his jaw and kept pace until he couldn't hide it anymore. On the second night, Infection set in from a shrapnel cut I'd ignored weeks earlier. His leg was swollen and red, the skin hot to the touch. We debated carrying him. We tried for an hour. It nearly killed us all. Stefan understood before we finished arguing. He gave Piotr his watch, said his wife would like it if she ever saw Piotr again. Then he asked us to leave him a rifle and one grenade. No speeches, no tears. He just said he'd delay anyone who found him. I told myself it was his decision. I tell myself that still. We lost Nowak the next day in an artillery burst that caught him while he was checking the path ahead. One moment he was there, rubbing his temples like an old man. The next, there was smoke and nothing left to command. After that, we were just men walking. By the time we reached the river line where friendly forces were rumored to be regrouping, there were 8 of us left from a company. 8 thin, hollow-eyed figures who smelled like sweat, smoke, and decay. The sentries nearly fired on us because we didn't look like soldiers anymore. Out of the original unit, that was it. No lists posted. No official accounting. Just absences. I was different too. I noticed it in small ways. I no longer jumped at the sound of gunfire, but I flinched at sudden kindness. When someone offered me food without expecting payment or explanation, my chest tightened like it had before an attack. I kept thinking about the prisoners we'd released, wondering if they made it, wondering if one of them would one day be on the other side of my sights. Older, harder, remembering a night when someone let him live. I stopped telling myself stories about heroism or necessity. I didn't try to balance some invisible moral ledger anymore. I just counted breaths, steps, the men still present. When replacements arrived weeks later, fresh faces, eager voices, I felt ancient. They talked about victory, about pushing back, about what would come after. I listened politely and said nothing, because I already knew something they hadn't learned yet. You don't come out of these things ahead. You only come out changed, and some changes never undo themselves. After we rejoined what was left of the line, the fighting settled into something grimly familiar again. Defensive positions, short advances, constant pressure from both sides trying to test where the other would break next. The scale shifted, but the human detail stayed the same. That's when my idea of the enemy finally stopped making sense. We started taking prisoners more often. Not because we were merciful, but because chaos made it unavoidable. You capture a group during a confused fight and suddenly there they are, standing in front of you, hands shaking, eyes scanning for any sign of what will happen next. Up close, there was nothing monstrous about them. They were thin. Their boots were torn like ours. They carried scraps of letters too, folded and refolded until the paper was almost dust. One man had a piece of bread wrapped carefully in cloth, as if it were something tender. During one lull, I shared a cigarette with a prisoner while guards argued about transport. We didn't speak the same language well enough for conversation, but we didn't need to. He exhaled smoke and stared at the ground the way men do when they're ashamed of being alive, while others aren't. That look was universal. At the same time, I saw cruelty from our side that I couldn't ignore anymore. Not constant, not always deliberate, but real. A rifle butt used when words failed. Food denied out of spite. A joke made while someone else was terrified. I understood how it happened. I just couldn't pretend it didn't. Allies disappointed me too. Orders came from far behind the lines, written by men who never smelled rot or heard what drowning sounds like in mud. Commanders changed. Some were competent, others reckless. A few were decent. None were immune to fear. The idea that we were good and they were evil began to feel childish. Too clean. Too simple for the reality of exhausted young men killing each other because maps and borders demanded it. That thought scared me. Not because it made me sympathetic, but because it made me unsure what, exactly, we were fighting for anymore. Survival was obvious. Loyalty to the man beside you was undeniable. But slogans and certainties dissolved under artillery fire. I still did my duty. I still followed orders when they came. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer thought, we must defeat them. I thought, how many more of us will be fed into this before it ends? And worse, how easily any of us might have been on the other side, given a different uniform and an earlier train ticket. Once that idea takes root, it never really leaves you. I remember the moment clearly, though I wish I could erase it. We were pinned down in a shattered village outside Stalingrad, shells raining down from every direction, smoke filling our lungs, mud and blood indistinguishable. For hours we'd been ordered to hold at all costs, even as our numbers dwindled and morale collapsed. I crouched in a crumbling cellar with Fritz, my closest friend, listening to the screams above. At some point, I realized I didn't care anymore if I lived or died. I couldn't even pray. I didn't believe anyone was listening. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely reload my rifle, and the faces of men I'd laughed with just weeks ago swam in my mind. Some dead, some screaming for help. Then came the order I couldn't follow. Fritz, we need a volunteer to scout the eastern flank. The rest of you stay here. I knew if I refused, I'd be shot for cowardice. But I also knew taking that path was almost certainly suicide. My stomach turned. My throat felt dry and tight. I could see Fritz looking at me, eyes wide, silently asking what I would do. I wanted to scream, to tell the commander to go to hell, to run into the mud and disappear. But I moved instead, shaking, barely conscious of the mud sucking at my boots, of the shell fire ripping holes in walls around me. My mind felt empty, screaming, pleading, yet numb all at once. And then something impossible happened. Fritz grabbed my arm and whispered, "Not alone. We go together." We sprinted side by side, bullets snapping around us. And for the first time I felt some twisted courage. Not pride. Just the desperate survival instinct that war strips you down to. By the time we reached the supposed safe spot, half of our group had been killed. I looked at Fritz, and he was bleeding from his leg. I felt nothing. The war had hollowed me out so completely that seeing him crumple in mud was like watching a scene in someone else's life. I helped him up, though, and together we kept moving, each step an act of defiance against the fear trying to drown me. That night, hiding in a barn, I realized I'd changed. I no longer thought about honor or orders. I only thought about survival and whether I could live with myself after what I'd done, what I'd seen. The fear wasn't even for myself anymore. It was for every man who looked to me to be brave when I felt broken inside. The breaking point wasn't a single shell or bullet. It was the accumulation, the endless grind of death, the impossible orders, the moral compromises we were forced to make. And yet, somehow, we survived. But survival didn't feel like victory. Not then. Not ever, really. Just when I thought we were trapped forever in that mud-choked village, something happened that no one could have predicted. We heard a low rumble at dawn, a sound so foreign and alive it made every nerve in my body scream. From the horizon, Soviet tanks appeared, moving fast, their treads crushing rubble and frozen ground alike. At first I thought it was another nightmare, some hallucination of exhaustion and hunger. But then the shells hit the German positions, and I realized we were caught between two fires. Fritz and I froze. Our unit had been told to hold the village at all costs, yet here came an enemy force that didn't negotiate, didn't care about our orders. And yet, amidst the chaos, a strange, almost absurd opportunity presented itself. The German soldiers guarding the village panicked. Some fled. Some were captured before they even realized what was happening. The fighting, fierce and disorganized, left small pockets of soldiers like us in the rubble, forgotten by both sides for precious minutes. In that moment, Fritz whispered, "We move now. We can't wait for orders. We can't survive if we stay." I nodded, though I didn't feel the courage, only an animal instinct to survive. We slipped through ruined streets, past the wreckage of tanks and burnt-out buildings, avoiding the firefights that ripped through the village like paper. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a potential death. But somehow, we made it. Later, we found ourselves among a group of civilians hiding in the cellar of what had once been a bakery. They looked at us with suspicion, fear, and a strange relief. I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't just running to survive the war. I was running toward life, toward something fragile and human. That unexpected counterattack, that chaos of metal and fire, had shifted everything. The orders to hold at all costs were meaningless now. Survival didn't come from obedience. It came from instinct, timing, and sheer luck. And yet I couldn't help but feel guilt gnawing at me. We had escaped, yes, but countless others hadn't. The thought of those I left behind, friends and strangers alike, haunted me even as I stepped into the pale morning light. For the first time in a long while, I felt something beyond fear and despair, a flicker of possibility. But even as that flicker glimmered, I knew the war had not finished with me. The brutality, the moral compromises, and the crushing weight of loss were still waiting. The aftermath of that unexpected chaos left us reeling. Fritz and I were alive. Yes, but the cost was staggering. Half of our unit had been killed in the fighting. Friends I'd shared rations, letters, and secrets with were gone, some never to be found. The village itself was a graveyard of rubble and smoke, civilians scattered or captured, and every corner reminded me of death. Our small group stumbled into a makeshift command post the next day, only to find our superiors arguing over who should be blamed for the collapse. There were no medals for surviving, no recognition for the courage it took just to keep moving. I felt the hollow pang of relief twist into shame. Every face I saw, dead or alive, reminded me of my failures, my inability to save more than a few. Fritz's leg worsened, infection setting in, and I did my best to bandage him with scraps of cloth and antiseptic stolen from a collapsed medical post. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing him, yet doing nothing would have been worse. Even the civilians we'd sheltered were wary of us now, treating us with polite distance as if they sensed our moral stains. The war escalated around us. Retreats turned into routes. Food was scarce, and frostbite claimed more of us than bullets. Prisoners were executed or starved. Every order demanded sacrifices that seemed increasingly meaningless. I began to understand that the war wasn't just about winning battles. It was about enduring loss, keeping your soul intact in a place designed to break. And yet, we survived. Somehow, we survived. But survival didn't feel triumphant. It felt like carrying a burden you can never lay down, a weight of grief and guilt that no sleep could ease. I realized that the consequences of the war weren't just measured in dead bodies or ruined towns. They were etched into the living, into every thought, every hesitation, every decision to act or remain passive. In that moment, I began to see the enemy differently. They were not monsters. They were frightened, exhausted humans making impossible choices. Some were cruel, some were compassionate. But they were like us, trapped in circumstances beyond reason, fighting for survival just as desperately. The lines between us and them blurred into mud and blood. After weeks of retreating, fighting and hiding, I began to see the war in shades of gray, instead of the rigid black and white our commanders had drilled into us. Up close, the enemy wasn't a uniform or a symbol. It was a man, trembling, hungry, scared, sometimes as helpless as I was. I saw Soviet soldiers sharing a piece of bread with a wounded comrade, saw German soldiers shaking with terror at an artillery strike. Cruelty existed, yes, but so did exhaustion, confusion, and fleeting acts of mercy. I found myself questioning everything I had been taught to believe. Orders shouted in the cold, barking, "Advance, hold, or eliminate the enemy," suddenly felt hollow. I remembered a small boy in the rubble, hiding with his mother, eyes wide with fear. I almost couldn't bring myself to raise my rifle. That hesitation, that human instinct to protect rather than kill, scared me more than any artillery barrage. And yet, I also learned that allies, those you fight beside, could surprise you in ways that no drill could prepare you for. Fritz, for instance, saved me more than once, dragging me through mud and shellfire when I wanted to collapse. Civilians showed quiet courage, offering food, directions, or just the warmth of a hearth when we could barely recognize hope. Even among soldiers, there were fleeting moments of true humanity. A shared joke in the trenches, a letter read aloud to keep morale, a hand extended to a trembling comrade. I began to understand that war didn't just change the way you fight, it changes how you see every human being. The enemy could be pitied, feared, even respected. Friends could betray or falter. And the definitions of bravery and cowardice weren't as simple as our training manuals suggested. Every choice, every step, every action was moral, whether we had the luxury of thinking about it or not. By the time I reached the outskirts of a liberated city months later, my perception had shifted completely. I no longer believed in absolute righteousness or simple justice. I believed in survival, in empathy when possible, and in the quiet dignity of those who endured, regardless of the side they fought on. The war ended for me not with a victorious charge or a triumphant march, but with exhaustion so deep it felt like my bones had been hollowed out. I was part of the final push toward Berlin, moving through ruined towns where every building, every street, whispered the names of those who had died. Fritz had fallen 2 weeks earlier to a sniper's bullet, and I hadn't cried. Couldn't. The numbness was too complete. When the fighting finally ceased, I was left in a city that had survived bombs and battles but was haunted by silence. The streets were littered with the dead and dying, the civilians staring at us soldiers with a mixture of fear, relief, and accusation. I realized then that the end of the war didn't bring peace. It only brought clarity about what had been lost. Returning home was a disorienting shock. My family greeted me with relief, yes, but also a subtle confusion, as if I were a stranger walking through their familiar world. I tried to explain, to tell them what it was like. The fear, the guilt, the endless waiting for orders. But words failed me. How could they understand the days spent crouched in mud, or the nights when a friend's scream haunted your sleep? I walked through my old neighborhood and everything seemed too bright, too alive. The war had left me hollow. The streets, the laughter, the smells of bread baking in ovens. It all felt alien. I was home, but I no longer belonged in the same way. My mind was full of ghosts, and my body carried the aches of survival. I understood, finally, that the war never truly leaves you. It lingers in your hands, your eyes, your thoughts, and your dreams. I've thought a lot about what it means to survive, to live through mud, blood, and fire, to watch friends die beside you, and then to walk home as if nothing had changed. It leaves a mark deeper than any wound. I've promised myself a few things. Never to blindly obey orders that feel wrong. Never to forget the faces of those who suffered. And never to let fear completely rule my actions again. I don't carry illusions of heroism. I don't believe war is noble. It is hell, pure and simple, and it teaches lessons you cannot unlearn. I've learned that courage is not about facing death with a rifle in hand. It's about maintaining a shred of humanity when everything around you demands you discard it. I've learned that enemies are human, allies fragile, and that survival is sometimes the only morality left. I've also learned about forgiveness. Of others, yes, but also of myself. The guilt I carry for those I couldn't save, for the moments I acted out of fear, it will never fully disappear. But living means acknowledging that weight and still moving forward, helping where I can, protecting the innocent when I have the chance. If anyone reads this in peacetime, I want you to understand something. War changes you, not just your body, but your mind, your heart, and your soul. Do not glorify it. Do not underestimate it. Treasure life, empathy, and the quiet courage of those who endure. Remember that every human friend, foe, or stranger carries their own fears, hopes, and losses. Treat them with that knowledge. I survived, but I am not the same. I may never feel fully at home again, and yet I carry a strange relief. Relief in life, in the chance to rebuild, to care, to be present. I carry memories of horror and small acts of kindness, of death and survival, intertwined. I write this as my confession, my testament, my warning. War takes everything from you, but how you choose to live after, that is still yours to decide.